Facts at your fingertips. Top unidentified American murderers. Often we hear of horrific murders in the news. However, the majority of the time, using eyewitness testimony, CCTV footage and forensic evidence, the murderer is found and imprisoned. But what about when the person behind the crime isn't found and to this day remains undiscovered? Perhaps they're still out there waiting for the next victim, or maybe they too have passed. Perhaps we will never know. Here are 4 of the top cases of unidentified murderers in America. The Doodler. The Doodler, commonly referred to as the Black Doodler, is an unidentified serial killer who is believed to be responsible for the murders of 14 gay men in San Francisco between the years of 1974 and 1975. 5 of the men were identified in the press as Doodler victims. These included Gerald Corviner, Joseph J. Stevens, Claus Chrisman, Frederick Capin, and Harold Goldberg. The Doodler was notorious for drawing his victims, having sexual encounters with them, and then murdering them. He often met his victims in bars or clubs and would sketch them on a paper napkin. He consistently killed his victims by stabbing them, and in the early stages of the investigation, police believed that there was more than one perpetrator. There are several surviving witnesses, including a Los Angeles man who in an interview with the police said that he was about to have sex with the African-American man until a knife fell out of his pocket. Despite this, the Doodler remains undiscovered. Texarkana Moonlight Murders. The Moonlight Murders occurred in Texarkana in 1946. The killer targeted young couples and was described by witnesses as wearing a white sack over his face with holes cut out to reveal his eyes. It is believed that he killed 5 people in 10 weeks, his first victims being Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry. On the 22nd of February 1946, the Phantom approached the couple parked in their car, blinding them with his flashlight. He held a gun to them and ordered them to get out of their vehicle. The Phantom told Jimmy to remove his trousers and then beat him, fracturing his skull. He then sexually assaulted Mary before letting her go. Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry both survived and were lucky in their escape from death. In the first week of May, the Phantom Killer attacked what are his last official victims, a husband and wife in their farmhouse northeast of town. Virgil Starks was killed by 2 shots to the back of his head, but his wife Katie survived, in spite of being shot twice in the face and having to run down the street to a neighbour's house to get help. Many people believe that local man named Yul Swinney, arrested in 1947 for auto theft, was the Phantom. His wife confessed to as much at the time, but by law she could not testify against her husband. She later removed her confession. Swinney remained in prison as a habitual offender until 1973 and died in 1994, without ever implicating himself in the murders. Many people remain unconvinced, as in 1999 and 2000 an anonymous woman contacted surviving family members of the Phantom's victims to apologise for what her father had done. However, Yul Swinney never had a daughter. The West Mesa Bone Collector. On the 2nd of February 2009, a woman walking her dog discovered a human bone in New Mexico. She reported her findings to the police. The police then went on to discover the bones of 11 women and a fetus, all buried in the sand. The youngest girl found was just 15 years old and the oldest 34. Most found were Hispanic and had been involved in drugs and prostitution. Fred Reynolds and Lorenzo Montoya were the main suspects. as Reynolds had reportedly possessed photos of the missing prostitutes, and Montoya lived 2 miles from the site, and it was reported that there had been tire tracks found from the burial site to his trailer. Despite the evidence held against them, both suspects had already died. Forensic experts weren't able to determine how the women were killed, and no eyewitnesses came forward. George Walker, a private investigator, started receiving cryptic, taunting phone calls and emails from someone claiming to have information about the killer, but the caller failed to come forward.
I know Nina. I know who killed her. I know who killed her, and I know who did it. And I know why. Okay, bye.
The Boston Strangler. The Boston Strangler is infamous for murdering 13 women in Boston, USA in the 1960s. Despite the murders being partly undiscovered, the blame was eventually given to Albert DeSalvo due to DNA evidence linking him to the last murder which took place. It has been argued that there was more than one person responsible, and the blame thus does not lie entirely in DeSalvo's hands. Between the years of 1962 and 1964, 13 women between the ages of 19 and 85 were murdered. Most of the women had let the suspect into their homes, as there was no sign of forced entry. In October 1964, DeSalvo entered a woman's apartment posing as a detective. After sexually assaulting her, he tied her to the bed and left, saying, "I'm sorry," as he did so. Most of the women were sexually assaulted and strangled to death by what was assumed to be a single man. The woman's description of her attacker led to the discovery of Albert DeSalvo. DeSalvo was not initially suspected, but had served time in prison for rape. When asked, he confessed to each of the 13 murders. He was then charged with life imprisonment. In February 1967, DeSalvo escaped from Bridgewater State Hospital. This triggered a full-scale manhunt. However, the next day he handed himself in and was transferred to a maximum security prison in Walpole, and 6 years later he was found stabbed to death in the infirmary. His killer was never identified. Many of these murders took place before advances in science and technology. Despite this, many recent murders remain unsolved and many remain undiscovered. Thank you for watching my video. Please subscribe to Facts at Your Fingertips to see more videos very soon.